Okay, we're going to continue our run through Fidel Castro's Cuba and talk about his foreign policies and how they contributed to his maintenance of power. Now, in the early years of Castro's rule, following the Bay of Pigs invasion, remember that Fidel Castro will sign a military defensive agreement with the Soviet Union that would bring Soviet weaponry into Cuba along with military advisors, including ballistic missiles that were equipped with nuclear warheads. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, with its guarantee from the United States that it would not invade Cuba, would solidify Castro's rule and certainly can be considered to have aided in his consolidation of power. Both the Bay of Pigs situation and the Cuban Missile Crisis are going to be used as propaganda tools for Castro's rule. The Soviet Union was clearly Cuba's most important economic and political partner. So the Soviet Union is going to provide Castro with that equipment and training that he needs for his military. They will also offer subsidies to the Cuban state for sugar purchases. They will provide oil to Cuba, and they will provide capital assistance, loans to Cuba to help the Cuban economy somewhat function. Without this Soviet economic assistance, Castro's maintenance of power would have been extremely difficult, and his economic situation in his country would have been even worse. Now, as we move through the 1960s into the 1970s, Fidel Castro will make a major part of his foreign policy the support of what we call national liberation movements in both Latin America and Africa. These countries that were moving towards independence or resisting outside interference, Fidel Castro will throw his support into left-leaning governments or left-leaning movements in these states. Castro believed that supporting these movements would help him gain further allies in the future, trade partners that he could engage with, which was essential because the Soviet Union is really the only friend he's got. His experience in helping him lead his own revolution in Cuba would translate well to these other movements around the world. Soviet support of the Cuban military would allow Fidel Castro to have the military capabilities to extend beyond Cuba's borders. Now, this would often frustrate the Soviet Union, especially during the 1970s, in this era of détente where the Soviet Union and the United States were having more engagement with each other, because Fidel Castro is off doing his own thing, and the Soviet foreign policy did not always align with Cuban foreign policy. Now, in Africa, much of the African continent through the 60s and 70s is gaining independence from those old colonial powers that had ruled and exploited African colonies since the late 19th century. As these newly independent states dealt with their own political and social unrest, Fidel Castro's Cuba would step in, supplying troops, doctors, educators, military advisors. Cuban forces would become particularly involved in the Angolan Civil War, which will wage from 1975 all the way into the 1990s. So after the independence of Angola from Portugal, that country was divided between fighting factions who were working for control of that state. On one side, we have the left-wing movement for the liberation of Angola that was supported by Cuba and got some outside assistance from the Soviet Union. To the right, we have the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola that was supported by countries like South Africa and the United States. Castro explained that his support for the MPLA was a movement against apartheid. He played on that civil rights aspect of this war. This would also be used to denigrate the United States and our own poor position on civil rights. He could often also use it to play upon the African heritage of many Cubans within the Cuban state. Now, success in this war translated into positive propaganda for Fidel Castro back home and a growth of Cuban nationalism and support for him. Also made him kind of a hero to many African liberation movements. This war, though, was incredibly costly for Cuba. Thousands of Cubans would be killed in Angola through the course of the war, and it was an economic drain on Cuba, an economic drain that Cuba could hardly afford. In 1988, both Cuba and South Africa would agree to end their role in the conflict, though the Civil War would continue for a few more years until the MPLA was ultimately victorious. That support of the MPLA, who ultimately gained that victory, though, would propel Cuba and Fidel Castro in the eyes of his own people and in the eyes of people outside of Cuba. Now, as we've already discussed about with regard to the economic situation in Cuba, the fall of the Soviet Union was disastrous for the Cuban state in Fidel Castro's rule. It ended the financial and military aid that Cuba had long been receiving. It ended Cuba's ability to support these revolutionary movements abroad. And it pushed Cuba into what we call the special period. Throughout the 1990s, Fidel Castro would soften his ideological stance that would allow new foreign investors from China, Canada, European countries like Spain into Cuba. And these new economic relationships would bolster a weak Cuban economy. He got a friend closer to home with the victory of Hugo Chavez in democratic elections in 2001 in Venezuela that would give him a new left-wing political ally and economic ally in the region. Venezuelan oil would begin to flow into Cuba, which would help strengthen that weakened Cuban economy following the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll talk to you next time.